tell you that the approach that I took a little bit to, Goldie always puts together such a fantastic agenda. And I know that there's any number of speakers that were here before me. So it's always kind of difficult to know what can I talk about that's going to be even halfway interesting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then even more so, what am I going to talk about? Because some of you actually may have heard me speak before. And so it's one of those, well, I don't want to hear the same stuff that I heard before. And then, of course, from the topic standpoint of being able to talk about transformation in government, that's such a broad-based topic, and there's so many different things that you can talk about that I really was challenged in terms of trying to think through, what was the right way to talk about it. And actually, what I thought I would do today is to talk about transformation and talk about leadership, but more from a personal perspective, to try to give you some view of what my job is, kind of what my day-to-day challenges are. And, despite the fact that I'm dealing with some very large numbers, and you'll see those numbers, because I want to give you some backdrop about that. What I would submit to you, and what I'd like you to be thinking about, is that the leadership challenges and the transformation challenges that I have are actually not different from the transformation and the kinds of leadership challenges that each of you have on a daily basis and the things that you are working to do. The size and scale might be different, but interestingly enough, as I've been through several of these jobs, the kinds of things that you have to do, the kinds of things that are important are very, very much the same. And so I'll talk about that as we go through. So, first of all, I want to give you a backdrop. I think all of you know DOD, and all of you have had some background in it, but just to sort of reinforce what it is that's a challenge for me on a daily basis is that, first of all, I think, as you know, we're big and we are distributed. I support over 3.3 million people, and that includes the civilian personnel as well as the Guard and Reserve. We're located in 163 countries. And many of those countries, as you know, is a challenge from the standpoint of being able to get connectivity, be able to actually get out and provide the kind of support that we want. And it gives me unique challenges in terms of how do you actually accomplish that and how do you make it happen. And then we're in probably over 6,000 different locations all over the world. And we're very mobile. So as you think about my customers and the kinds of things that my customers do, they're often either on a helicopter or the one picture that you see there, which I think is one that's very recent, is really a Navy Growler taking off from an Air Force base in Italy in response to the American support, the US support in Libya. So my challenge is getting communications to work, not just on the ground in really remote areas, but also being able to get that communications to work on the fly. And in fact, one of my biggest challenges is making sure, because DOD has the responsibility to make sure that the president has connectivity, certainly as he needs to be on any number of different aircraft, particularly in an emergency situation. Now with that, it's also not just about us. So as we talk about some of the things we have to do, one of my challenges is that I can't simply say, well, I'm going to wall off my networks, or I'm going to think about cyber that we're going to talk about in a bit as it just relates to DOD. We are very heavily invested in working with our international partners. In fact, we aren't going to go into another conflict that isn't where we are a part of that force that actually goes in. And so with that, that means that I've got coalition partners, not just NATO partners, but as we move into Asia Pacific, it's any number of partners, some of whom, interestingly enough, for instance, may use Gmail as their way of doing email, which brings with it the unique connectivity challenges, the unique kinds of security challenges. Clearly, NATO is actually a body that is organized, and so as we talk about technical standards and we talk about the ways we want to communicate, NATO actually is a good organizing body. May move a little slowly or a little more slowly than we always necessarily want them to be, but at the same token, they're a great set of partners that we've worked with for a long time, and so we're able to do a lot of good work with them. And it's going to be military as well as civilian. Because we also, and I think something we don't think about from an information technology perspective, is it's our responsibility not just to support military operations, but also support humanitarian operations. And that really means working with the other federal and state and local agencies, and it means connectivity with public safety. And so now we have to worry about, in the case where we would go in, for instance, to support Hurricane Sandy, how in fact do we communicate and make sure that communication is seamless. And outside the US, it's really about not only military, but it's disaster relief. It's the Red Cross, it's any number of organizations. So when you think about the context of the kind of work we do, it's easy to think a helicopter, it's easy to think a young man or woman on the ground with a radio, but it is in the context of the broader set of technologies that we have to provide. And the last piece of this that's important is there's nothing that we do in DoD from the standpoint of national security that does not rely on connectivity. Now, the interesting thing is that at DoD, everyone just assumed that connectivity until the challenge of cybersecurity and the challenge of that connectivity being actually threatened. And I think that brought into light for many of our senior leaders the fact that we depend on that connectivity pretty much with every piece of equipment that we have, and it becomes a major backdrop to what we expect to be there in order to fight. And to do that, we have to think about how we will operate when that connectivity is disrupted, how we will operate when it's denied in a broader area, and what does that actually mean? So in order to govern all of that and make sure that we are in fact giving you, the taxpayer, the best national security and Department of Defense activities, really what is it that my role is? And I go through this because it's a leadership question in terms of what's your role in the organization and how in fact do you leverage that role in terms of trying to influence and transform what your organization is doing. So first of all, I have the sort of dubious designation as principal advisor. Well, while that might sound all well and good, it doesn't carry with it the direct authority to say to somebody, you either go do this or I am going to take your money away, or I am going to, there's some other gigantic penalty that I'm going to impose on you. But rather it means that my job is to tell the Secretary of Defense how I feel that the technology dollars should be spent, where I feel they should be spent, and how we as an organization should use technology. Now to do that, we manage about 40% of the federal government technology spend. So our FY14 submission, or I should say our FY13 budget is at about $39 billion from an IT perspective. And that money is distributed across 4 services, so the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, and over 40 defense agencies. I'm going to come back to that because it's the leadership challenge when you really want to transform the way the organization spends that money, is that it really has to do with how do you come across all of those organizations in order to go in a single direction. And historically, our spend has been very decentralized. And I don't mean decentralized just to the point of each of the military departments, but actually down to the point where much of that money got distributed down to what we call the base, post, camp, and station level. So in many ways, the standards that we set, the way that we actually govern that IT spend, has to be something that if in fact we're, at the point in time, let's pick 10 years ago, when we went into Afghanistan, it has to actually impact individuals that are spending money at that point in time to actually determine what our overall spend should be and how we are actually going to set up and run that technology. So with that, what are the kinds of challenges that I face? And for those of you, how many of you are in IT organizations today? Many of you? Okay. Well, hopefully what you're going to see here is actually not terribly different from the kinds of things that you face today. There are many, many similarities, sometimes a little different scale, sometimes a little bit different emphasis, but much the same kinds of challenges. First of all, for us, first and foremost on our mind is cybersecurity. Clearly, we're concerned not only from the standpoint of external threat, and the external threat, as all of you know, comes in many different versions and many different varieties. And clearly we are the target, not only from the standpoint of disruption of our capability, but also exfiltration of information, which is a big, gigantic issue for us as we think ahead. Secondly, as all of you've read, you're all in the area, you know what sequestration is about. You know the challenges the DoD has from the standpoint of shrinking budgets. And it's really making us think about structural issues inside DoD that we've not really faced in the near past. We've certainly, since 9/11, had a very different cadence of the way that we've looked at dollars, and clearly with the budget situation the way it is now, that's changing. And so we're really questioning a lot of the fundamentals. And with that comes, how are we spending our IT dollars? Is it the most efficient way to spend our IT dollars? And interestingly enough, those questions that face us from the standpoint of how are we spending our dollars actually are the same questions that say, can we continue to protect DoD from a cyber perspective if in fact our technology is very decentralized, if in fact it's being done in multiple locations, and by multiple I mean by the hundreds, and how in fact can we assure that our information is protected? And I think all of you who are in the IT organizations face that challenge. Maybe on a smaller scale, maybe you pick your number of agencies, you pick your number of departments, but the challenge is that we've grown up from a legacy perspective, allowing individual organizations to do what they needed to do for their individual mission without thinking about what does that mean across the entire organization. And in that sense, DoD is particularly focused on the larger organization because each of our services goes in together and is becoming more and more interdependent in terms of the kinds of conflicts that we're going to be involved in. The next is that we are changing partners. So as we shift, as we move out of Afghanistan, as we look at the deployment of forces into Asia Pacific, that's a whole different group of countries to work with. And for me, it's a whole different set of countries to be thinking about how am I going to connect in a very secure way. And interestingly enough, as we shift into Asia Pacific, it moves me away from a set organization like NATO that can impose certain kinds of standards on their member countries into a world where I'm dealing more with individual countries and trying to put in place certain kinds of standards so that we can ensure connectivity. The other challenge for us in Asia Pacific is we may need to partner with a group of countries for a specific mission, very similar, for instance, when we went in to help after the tsunami in Japan, but there may be another set of circumstances where we have another set of partners. And so how do I connect them to the network in a secure way for the limited amount of time that I will be working with them, and then be able to move them off the network or into another area of the network with different types of data, different kinds of security requirements. And then finally, it's really the question of, as we move into these different arenas, the way that we go in and the kinds of needs that we're going to have are going to change. So we're very used to, in many situations, and have been used to in the past, going in with a large ground force. When you get into Asia Pacific, we're going to be much more dependent upon air and sea. That's a different kind of connectivity for me. That's not fiber in the ground. It's actually looking at how, in fact, do we look at use of our SATCOM You know, how much is going to be military SATCOM, how much is going to be commercial SATCOM. So it changes the dynamic of the way we look at how we provide those the communication capability. But with that, there's a lot of things that we're doing that are very similar to things that you're looking at, things that others in the federal government are looking at. So I know, for instance, Steve Van Rokel is going to be here later today, and he'll be talking about many of the federal initiatives that he is really focused on. Many of the things that were done initially under Vivek Kundra. And so there are a number of things here where I'm working on the very same things that you're working on, perhaps in a little bit different scale. So first of all, let's talk about shared services. One of the challenges for me isn't necessarily shared services as it relates to my buying a service from your agency or your agency buying a service from me. It's really about how do I get the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps comfortable with buying services from each other. And that's not because, you know, they're not interested in saving money, but their mission has always been very much focused on, I provide the service for my branch of the military. And I need to be able to control that in order to be able to move ahead. Now, the challenge with that isn't only cost savings. What we're finding, and what General Alexander would say, is that if we do networks differently for each service, and we have multiple networks in a location, it's nearly impossible for him to actually be able to protect those networks. So we have to come in and design our networks to operate in what we call a joint environment, so that it doesn't matter which service you are, you're going to come into an environment and you're going to do things in the same way. Because as all of you know, once you have an installed base, very difficult to get it out. So for instance, 10 years in Afghanistan and there are still 11 email systems running there. So it's really critical that we get this work done up front, and so that we're able to go into these environments. And I'm sure all of you have a very, very similar challenge in terms of getting your organizations to think about how you can operate differently. The other piece of this, interestingly enough, is that it's not only a cost-saving measure, and it's not only a measure of being able to better share information and protect from a cybersecurity perspective, but we believe that it's also going to help us operationally. We have lots of operation centers, lots of help desks, lots of folks running our networks. And clearly, the more we have, the more there's redundancy and the more opportunity there is for downtime, particularly as we distribute it. One of the stories that I like to tell is a friend of mine from California, actually is a Navy reservist. And he was in the IT business, and he came to DC in order to do his active duty. And he showed up in his unit, and someone in his unit said, we've been trying to install SharePoint. You're an IT guy. Why don't you put in SharePoint for us? Now, I'd like to tell you that that's an old story. It's actually a story from a year ago. So it shows you I still got a lot of work to do in terms of being able to get control and be able to get folks to listen to standards and be able to operate services from somebody else. But it is symptomatic of the challenges that we face in terms of trying to get IT to operate effectively and efficiently in our organizations. Second thing is, we're definitely thinking about what does it mean for us to move to the cloud? Very difficult for us to kind of think through the topic of when would we use commercial cloud services? When will they be secure enough? That's why we're one of the tri-chairs of the FedRAMP program, because we think that it's so important that we be involved in certifying companies that are actually coming in from a security perspective, for the federal government. We have actually created a concept called a cloud broker, because I've got over 800 data centers today. What I've said is if I go from 800 data centers to 800 clouds, I'm actually not better off, I'm actually worse off. And so the challenge is, how do I take advantage of commercial cloud services? How do I think about where a private cloud makes sense for me and use the cloud as a way of bringing together the joint information enterprise? And what kinds of information do I need? And then there's a challenge with cloud, and I'm sure all of you are facing it, is what are the commercial arrangements? Once I'm in the cloud, how do I ensure information sharing across the different partners that I have? The next very much for us is mobility. One of the things that we want to do is to move to the use of commercial mobile devices. Not because I necessarily am ready to go BYOD, but because the cycle in DoD to bring in new technology, in some cases, some of our major acquisition processes are close to over 75 to 80 months, which of course means that technology has passed us by. And mobility is one of those areas where it was actually taking us longer to certify devices and be able to get them into operation than there was a new cycle of technology coming in. So one of the things that we focused on is how do we bring mobile devices in? How do we work on what a mobile device management system would be, again, for all of DoD, not having each organization create their own, and then an application store. And for us, the challenge is how do we make sure we can do it at the unclassified level, and then of course we have the classified level as well as the top secret level. So our challenges in terms of certifying the devices are different. But across the federal government, that's also going to be a challenge. For each of the federal agencies, all of you are also running classified networks. All of you are going to have the demand for some of your customers to really need to have a mobile device that gives you that kind of connectivity. So we're working very closely with GSA, very closely with the federal initiative, because I think all of us are going to be challenged. Big data. It's probably not a good time to be talking about big data. But I will, because it is an important and critical part of what we do. We are dealing with an enormous collection of information. We have to be able to do the analytics and be able to protect from a cyber perspective, not at the speed of when a human can look at information, but we have to be able to do it at the speed of computer to computer, so that effectively the information's coming in, we're looking at that information, and then we're able to actually respond in terms of protecting our networks at computer to computer speed. So big data is going to be so critically important to us. It's important to us now. That combined with the cloud structure is really going to be critical as we move forward. And then, again, unified communications. This is another service issue. One of the things I'm working to do is to get folks to move off their old switching technology, to move on to unified communications, and then be able to look at what the future capabilities are. And then I put this last one in because I know that we had a presentation for those of you that were here about healthcare. And so you don't normally think of, well, how is DoD involved in healthcare? Well, we are. I mean, it's our challenge to be able to ensure that our current service members are taken care of, but we have a responsibility to make sure that we're transferring our information to Veterans Affairs and that we're looking at an integrated health record with Veterans Affairs. So even something like healthcare, which one might not necessarily think is a big deal for DoD, is a huge deal for us, particularly now as we want to make sure that veterans are taken care of. So we have to make sure that we are a part of the affordable health care, that we are actually working together to make sure that we are following the same kinds of data exchange standards. So many of the challenges, again, that all of you are facing in your various areas are things that we're challenged with. Where are some things where we're different? Well, first of all, obviously the cyber threat for us is significantly greater. The need for us not only to protect DoD, but also to be able to have indicators working with the FBI, with DHS, and in terms of what are some of the threats coming into us. We have to make sure, again, that we're talking about 3 networks, not 1 network in terms of security and what are the varying levels of that. Our global reach. I have to ensure that we have the ability to be secure, whether you're in the Pentagon or whether you're in Afghanistan, whether you're in the Asia-Pacific region. And then I have to make sure that from an international partner standpoint, again, that they've got access to our networks. The next one is that I'm kind of the bad guy on spectrum. So I'm the guy that's saying how much spectrum can the commercial industry use? How do they use spectrum that I have? Because all of us are more and more connected to the network. That means we're all going to need spectrum. And clearly the federal utilization of that spectrum is a big part of what I do. I'm also part and responsible for position, navigation, and timing, which is the GPS systems. And that's a challenge in terms of making sure that your GPS is not disrupted. Now, how many of you knew that your GPS came from Air Force satellites? All right, that's great. Because a lot of people, including my dad, thought it came from Google. So I just want you guys to know that, Air Force is a big part of this. And a part of that, of course, is our satellite communications and our part in national security policy. So the question is, how do I lead? Well, I think the challenge for me in a big organization is initially to focus on, number one, being clear about what I believe are the objectives for the organization. So we actually focus a lot of our time on putting out strategy, and not complex strategy, but strategy that has a specific set of initiatives that we believe the organization needs to focus on. So we put out a mobility strategy. We have a spectrum strategy. We're working on a cyber defense strategy. And we have our joint information enterprise. So it's very important when you're trying to communicate with 250,000 IT folks, as well as their leadership, to have a very clear, articulated view of where we believe the organization should go. Now, I influence by virtue of policy. I don't influence by virtue of saying, you only have so much money, this is what you can spend, and this is what you can do. And so that's a challenge, because I don't have the ability to point at somebody and say, if you don't do this, you will be fired. Again, it has to be something where it's clearly articulated. Now, in doing that, there's a couple of ways that I look at enforcing that. One is to team, and one of my big partners is the acquisition organization. Because what, in fact, I say to the acquisition guys is, if in fact they come in to acquire this type of technology, I only want you to be able to let them have that technology if it meets these particular standards. And that's just one of the partnerships that is so critical. So much of what I do isn't through direct control, but it's through influencing decisions, influencing others in the organization. And to do that, I can't do that unless I've partnered in the building. You know, I've been in DOD about 2.5 years now, and when Bill Lynn recruited me, I said, you know, I'm not military experience, I have no DOD experience, and he said to me, well, you know, he said, you have all this other industry experience, you have all this other state experience, we can teach you the Pentagon. Well, I've said to Bill, not really, right? I mean, it took me probably a year just to get through sentences which were all acronyms, and acronyms can be verbs, which I didn't know before. And the other thing is that people were so used to the acronyms, they couldn't actually say what the acronym meant because the acronym had become a word. So that's sort of my, you know, kind of bellwether for, yeah, I had to have partners who were influential in the building who could help me make things happen. So let me just give you an example. On the mobility strategy, and I wouldn't have thought that this would have been the individual who would have been my partner, but it is General Dempsey, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's focused on innovation, he's focused on technology innovation, and so with him talking about the same thing, we were able to really push it through. Joint Information Enterprise, General Keith Alexander and myself working with General Dempsey, we're really pushing that strategy through. On Spectrum, I work very much directly with the Deputy Secretary Carter, who's very interested in technology, very interested in Spectrum. And then the other thing and the point I want to leave with you is that that may not be the natural partner. One would have thought, well, perhaps I should have partnered with other political appointees, which in some cases are true, but in my world, being able to partner with the military, which is where the money is, which is where the direction is, was really much more beneficial in terms of being able to move things forward. So with that, I hope that I've been able to give you a little bit of flavor of my world. Interesting and fascinating. I absolutely love it. I mean, folks are just so dedicated to what they do. But also try to give you some feeling for how some of the things that I'm faced with, some of the challenges that I've got, are very similar to the challenges that all of you have. But what I'd like to leave you with, because my time is up, is that I have the best customers in the world. They are demanding, they need a lot from me, but if in fact there are things that we can do that make their world just a little bit better, it is an enormously, enormously fulfilling experience. So with that, if we can roll the video, please. Thanks very much. I really appreciate everything. I really appreciate your attention today. I think that hopefully I've been able to share with you, we all have many of the same challenges. But clearly, this is what we do this is really why we do what we do and why we feel it's so important. Thanks very much, everybody.